I rise to also speak on this motion, and I thank the member for Bass Lara Alexander for bringing it forward, because I think it is very important, not just for the members who are assembled here today, but also for the Greek, Assyrian and Armenian communities that now reside in Tasmania. And I think it's important that we do remember history, because as it's been said before, if we don't remember history, we will repeat it. Now, we have to put, pardon me, when we look at a map of Europe, we see it as it is now, but it hasn't been like that for very long in reality. And what we see is a horrible history of dispossession and genocide, like was seen during the collapse of what was the Ottoman Empire. Armenians had been in Anatolia, an area you could call Anatolia, since the 6th century BC at least. So they've been there a very long time. The Greeks had probably been there longer in trading communities, especially along the coastline of the Mediterranean, and as had the Assyrians that also had a presence. This whole area was multi-ethnic and had been for a long time, and in fact it had had a long history of invasion, of empires rising and empires collapsing. But it was the collapse of this last empire, the Ottoman Empire, which saw one of history's great outrages. It was during the collapse of this Ottoman Empire where a bunch of people who could be best described as ideologues came upon the idea of creating a Turkic-speaking nation. The people of the Turkic-speaking had arrived in the area of Anatolia, or now Turkey, about the 11th century, migrating from the steppes of Eurasia. Huge upheavals in Europe at the time. They came from the steppes of Eurasia, stretching as far as Mongolia, and colonised and invaded and took over parts of what we now call Turkey. So they were relatively recent compared to the long history of the Armenians and Greeks especially, and Assyrians. But it was these young ideologues that came upon the idea, during this collapse, they saw an opportunity to create something new. And that something new was going to be an ethnically pure, an ethnically consistent territory. And the only way they thought about creating that territory was to purge all the minorities who could threaten the formation of an ethnically based Turkish nation. And that's what we saw. This was the Young Turk Revolution. The outcome of that was horrific. It was horrific. It is one of those genocides that we should all remember. There was outrage after outrage. There were forced marches where people were marched to their deaths along the march, but also marched out into the desert to starve and die of thirst. There were trenches dug and people murdered on the spot. There were rapes. There were dispossessions. There were forced conversions to Islam. There were also children sold into virtual slavery. This is the history that we need to remember. We must remember. It was people who did this. It was no doubt ordinary people. It wasn't just ideologues, but we have to remember how a country or a group of people can get to a point where they would do something like this. The Armenians and the Greeks and the Assyrians at times fought back. They formed groups. They tried to protect their communities, but in effect, this just led to further outrages. It created the pretext for further outrages. All based on a world that was rapidly changing, but there is no excuse for what happened. I think it is alleged that, not everybody responsible for this was brought to justice either, I might add. Basically, after the collapse of World War, the end of World War I and the Ottoman Empire finally fading into history, there were groups who were prosecuted for war crimes. Some of those were actually given asylum in countries like Germany and so on. Some were brought to justice, but a lot weren't. Some were actually assassinated by Armenians who found them. And we see history repeating itself only 50 or so years later. But it is alleged that it was Hitler who said, "Who remembers the Armenians?" when he was formulating the genocide. That was his excuse. Who remembers the Armenians? It was a genocide that the world didn't recognise. Well, I think today the Parliament of Tasmania does remember the Armenians, just like we remember the Greeks, just like we remember the Assyrians who were subject to such a horrific genocide. And if we don't remember things like this, then we are doomed to repeat it. So in saying that, I'd really like to thank the member for Bass, Lara Alexander, for bringing this motion. I think it's quite important. I'd like to thank the members of the community who are here today and add my few words to this motion. Thank you.